Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Addictive Culture podcast. I'm very excited today because this is the first episode of a series we're doing on the first two chapters of the book of Job from Hebrew to English, and what I believe is a better translation than what we have out there. What I've done is I haven't translated this word for word. And what I mean by that is what one word was in Hebrew, we fast forward to modern day, and this is what that word became in English. That's not really what I've done here. I've looked at the meaning and done hours of research of what these words meant in the Hebrew language, and I have given more long-winded responses, essentially, to make better sense of it for us in the English language. And I think that this is important. So, for this being a ministry that focuses on trying to give people good biblical information, how do we look at the Bible with some of these interesting stories that we have that seem larger than life, and how do we look at them properly? And I think that this will help atheists, agnostic, and Christians alike because things are not what they seem in our modern English context that we have today when we're looking at ancient text and another language and a heavily poetic language that's very complex, and it's very precise, and it's very to the point, where English is kind of vague and it's really difficult sometimes. And I'll give you a good example of this. This is the example as I've been doing my studies that I've used for myself. There's a common trope in American television shows where you have the guy and the girl, and one of them has feelings for the other, but the other, you're not sure if the other has feelings for them, and they'll have a text message sent to the other, and they're trying to read that text message, and they're misinterpreting the tone of the message because English can be kind of vague. An example of this is if I text a friend of mine and they say, "Hey, can you hang out tonight?" And I respond with, "I'm sorry, I can't. I'm going to grab the pizza that my wife and I love. I really love her and I'm hanging out with her tonight." From that textual standpoint, all you can see is the word love and love, and there's no distinction between the two of those. You have to assume that I mean that I love my wife in a superior way than I love that pizza. And that's kind of a funny, comical way to describe it, but it's very accurate. And as an example to this, there's like six words for love in Greek, for example, for the New Testament. And then you look in Hebrew and there's multiple words for things that just get really specific. And they're very poetic languages, they're very purposeful with tons of meaning. And one of the most important things to note as we get into this episode, names of places and people are extremely important, and they were held with high importance in these time periods that we're reading in when we're in scripture. And even in those parts of the world today, you look even at Islam, which has adopted many of these kind of Christian Judaism kind of ways of living, where they have specific meaning to the names of the people that they have. Their sons and daughters are named with names that mean something. That's kind of contrary to this day and age, and it's a concept we're not really familiar with these days. And so I started this series, and I started to study primarily because I've been doing another study in the book of Luke, particularly in the Beatitudes, and you can find that series in text format in the community page of this channel. Or if you go to the description of this channel, you will find a link to my blog, and that's where I'm posting more sermon style notes in text format there for you to read. There's no comments open for these videos, but there are comments open uh, on those textual formats that I'm posting. And as I was going through my Beatitudes, I fast forwarded a little bit through Luke to Luke 16:19 through 31, which is the parable of the beggar Lazarus. And if you haven't read that, I would encourage you to click pause right now and grab a Bible or go online, and I want you to read that because I think it's extremely important. And as I was reading it, I realized something for the first time, that that story that Jesus was telling, that poetic story, that parable, was a direct drawback to the book of Job. And so I started going and I was like, let me just read the first few chapters of Job to like recenter myself. And just the opening line, really, I was struck by it for the first time. The opening lines of the book of Job read, "In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job." So I got very curious about that because that just seemed very interesting to me. And so I was like, oh, well, what does Job's name mean in the Hebrew? And then I found that out and I was like, well, oh my gosh, what does the land of Uz mean in Hebrew? And so I satisfied this craving of mine to know what this book was really about with this translation. In the land of counsel, there lived a man whose name was persecuted. Job's name means persecuted. Uz translates to counsel. And I was immediately hooked into translating this from what I view as every key word in chapters 1 or 2. I might have missed one here or there, but every one that I found important. I've spent hours researching this and talking to people about this and debating about this. And that's the translation for the first verse that I've settled on. And so this is kind of where I want us to freeze at for a moment because this is important. There's about a 50-50 split between theologians in our current time and even experts outside of Christianity that the book of Job was either one, a real person, and maybe these events were real and maybe they were poetic, or two, and this is the one that I lean towards, and I'm going to give you evidence throughout this series to why. I think that the book of Job was all one big parable, a poetic story that was meant to point us to something and make us think, just in the same way that Jesus told parables all the time. And I'll even give you an example of this that I think adds some validity to what I'm saying. There are two mentions in the New Testament of Job. One is in James, and James is only using Job as an example of character, which you can do with someone who's fictitious or not. If I want to look to you and I can say, if somebody says, how should I treat a woman that I have feelings for? I can make the funny comparison and I can say, I think Fred from Scooby Doo is a great example, man. He had women around him who were his friends and he treated them with respect like they were just buddies of his. That's a funny example. And I can use that because even though he's not a real person and he's just a character. And then I think the most compelling case for the fact that the book of Job was poetic and not literal comes from Jesus, actually, because the only other mention of Job, and I think it's the most accurate usage of the book of Job mentioned in the New Testament, is this parable of the beggar Lazarus that Jesus tells. And I think it's a direct drawback, and it's no coincidence that he used it as a poetic story in a different form using the beggar Lazarus. And then I think that the book of Job is also just poetic. And so we have to read the scriptures with God and with Jesus at the center of them in this way. We have to be open to the fact that Jesus as God throughout history has used poetry and poetic symbolism as a means of communication to make us think. You can't just take everything that they say as literal. For an example, if we look at Catholicism, Catholicism will teach you that communion, the drinking of the wine, eating of the bread, that Jesus makes his flesh, the bread turn into flesh and the wine turn into blood. And this is just unbiblical. If you look at the writing tone and format at which it's used at the Last Supper when Jesus says, this is, my body broken for you and my blood poured out for you. Eat of it and drink of it. He's using poetry very heavily. And so that teaching is just false by the Catholics. And we have to use this. And we look to this book and we see something amazing. If you look at the book in English, all you're going to see for God is the names God and Lord. But if you look at what this is in its actual Hebrew language, every name for God in the Hebrew is used. Eloah, El, Yahweh, and all these words describe different parts of God, different parts of his power and his authority and his perfection. Uh, each of them means something different. And as you read the book, you can see how different people think of God and how they view him. For example, the first part of chapter 1, uh, God is only ever mentioned as like divine being, or we would say as Lord. And it's kind of a more impersonal name for God. But if you fast forward to the last chapter of the book, God is only mentioned by Yahweh, which is his most personal name. And if you look at chapter 1, the first part of chapter 1 calls him basically Lord. But if you fast forward to it, when it gets to the point from God's perspective, it calls him Yahweh. And so we're going from the impersonal to the extremely personal and intimate. And this is important Because we have Job, who's being described as this amazing guy who fears the Lord and follows him. But at the end of the book, we have this beautiful moment with Job that says, I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. There were things that Job didn't understand about the Lord, and then he comes to know them. So as we're going through books like this, we need the Shema or Shema, however you want to pronounce that. It's the Hebrew word that means listen or to hear. And it means to hear with appropriate action, and then to hear and then follow with appropriate action. And what a lot of people who are far smarter than I am, different scholars, pretty much agree on is that Job was not an Israelite, yet he practiced the rituals that the Israelites were for following Yahweh. He was the spiritual leader of his family. They believe this took place. If I'm getting my information correct, I believe that scholars believe that Job's time period was supposed to take place before the Levitical priests. I could be slightly wrong on that. But I want to start now. I want to take us through just the first maybe verse or two here, or part of maybe the first verse. So we have in the land of Uz, there was a man whose name was Job. So Uz is mentioned in various places throughout Scripture, and this word does translate to counsel. And then we have Job, and it translates to persecuted. This is important because things get really lost when we're switching translations and when we're trying to translate things. So, for example, you're not going to get even the full understanding of what Job's name actually is, because if you look at Job's name and try to pronounce it in the Hebrew versus in English, you're going to see that there's already a strong disconnect. So when we're taking this and we're reading it in its original language, and we have that he's in a place called council, and there's a man named persecuted, we need to read very carefully because things are not what they appear to be. Uh, we have to look with the meaning that's trying to be conveyed by the author for the whole book as a picture. And there are poetic exaggerations that are used throughout this book that are meant to make us think, and they're meant to point us closer to God. The book of Job, for example, is a part of Scripture that's known as wisdom literature. These are books we're meant to infer meaning from based on their context in the biblical narrative and the time period that they were in to teach us lessons. And we're reading true poetic literary genius in this because God is using this in like a really whimsical, creative way with these exaggerations to explain literal concepts to us. And as humans, our brains are really wired to receive information that way. That's why we have interesting things like if you're an artist, you can say things through lyrics in a song that you don't know how to say in your own words to a person or to convey a feeling. Because poetry helps us explain these things through helpful exaggerations, not for manipulation, but for helping our brains to understand things. So, with that being said, we're going to see some things throughout chapter one as we get into this series. So, we're going to see that Lucifer, the devil, Satan, his title is the Satan. That's not a name, that's a Hebrew title, and it means the adversary. So, we have an adversary who's talking to the divine being, or Yahweh, which translates to I am, or more accurately, I will create what I have created. And he's asking to attack a man whose name is persecuted. And God, we see again in that part of the book later on, my eyes have seen. Instead of my ears just hearing about you, now my eyes have seen you. So Job realizes something about God through these lessons. And this is taking place in a place called council. And this is why I think that the book of Job is not literal, but it's just more poetic in nature. And it's meant to make us look at Job and how Job interacts with God and how this interaction that's given to us of Lucifer and Yahweh, and they're in heaven and they're having this verbal kung fu match over Job and over his life. And as we continue on in this series, we're going to see these moments come up where Lucifer tries to infer something out of God's personality and his character that's not true. And God allows Satan to to attack Job with persecution to teach us something. And so when we look to a description of Job, it says, this man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. So as I was reading the word blameless, it really stuck out to me as being odd. It seemed out of place and like a poor choice of words for the translation. This is actually the Hebrew word tam, which means innocence, honesty, and naivety, complete, guiltless, integrity, peaceful, or perfect one. My favorite of these, and I believe it captures the meaning extremely well, is naivety or naive. And this is the sort of naivety that it's not used as an insulting way. In our English culture, in our American culture, in our Western culture, we would believe this word to be something that looks down on an individual. And I'll give an example of this. My previous job, I'm a homeschool graduate, and at my previous job, my management refused to promote me specifically because I had a homeschool GED. I had a homeschool diploma, essentially. It wasn't a GED, it was a diploma issued, and by the state of Missouri, that's a legal document. But I was told I wasn't qualified because I didn't go to actual high school. And so they looked at me as naive or somebody who was not capable because of that. But the kind of naivety that's being mentioned here is not that kind of naivety. What we're looking at is the naivety that took place in the garden with Adam and Eve. See, Adam and Eve already had an understanding of what was right from wrong because they knew it was good to follow the command of God. The tree just gave them more insight to the wisdom of what could be done with wrong and what should be done with right. And that's why, as a married couple, which is completely fine for them to be nude in front of each other, especially when no other humans existed, Adam and Eve realize that they're naked and they hide from each other because of what they could do with the other's nudity, with evil. And so that's the kind of naivety we're looking for, the naivety that they had before they were affected by the fall of sin and had information that they took for themselves versus allowing God to grant them wisdom, the wisdom that comes through following Him and making ourselves as if we're naive to the evil that we could be doing. And this is just really important because this is God's mercy that He would create us with this plan in mind to aid us against evil, against opposing Him. As much as they don't like to admit it, atheists, this actually defeats the argument for atheism, claiming that God is evil or cruel for creating mankind, knowing that we'd be imperfect and we would be choosing evil. God gives free will, even though He knew we would deny Him, but orchestrates all of creation around redeeming us. And He does this through Jesus, and He does this through the covenants that He makes for us. When we're reading the word God in this verse, it's the word Elohim, meaning divine being. God is the creator, and we are creation, constantly questioning He who made us, thinking somehow we set the tone for morality against Him. And likewise, this word feared, this is the Hebrew word yare, from Yair, meaning fearing, morally reverent. This is a respect based fear, meaning that we are flawed because we are bound in limits, not in worthlessness. God is outside of limits, making Him perfect. And in His perfection and our lack thereof, we have the kind of strong relationship we can/do with God. The powerful thing about this word is that it also means awe, like to see something incredible like the Grand Canyon and to be in awe because of its greatness. This word has a connection in the spelling and pronunciation with God's own name, Yahweh. And this is actually a kind of wordplay that's really common throughout Scripture. And this word shun in Hebrew is a word that I'm going to pronounce as wazar, and that's probably very wrong. It means to turn aside, to put an end to, or to reject. When we read evil, this is the Hebrew word ra, and it's not as clear cut as we think, but provides a great example of how non-descriptive English is as a language. So here are some of the definitions of what evil means in this context: bad, disagreeable, malignant, unpleasant, giving pain, unhappiness, misery, displeasing, sad, unhappy, hurtful, unkind, vicious in disposition, in general, ethically wicked. And this English word malignant, I think, is a great example. And here are its meanings. And I think we're going to see what sin really means to fail at reflecting God: spiteful, hostile, malevolent, malicious, malign, baleful, full of hate, vicious, nasty, poisonous/venomous, cruel, opposite, invasive, uncontrollable, dangerous, harmful, deadly, fatal, life-threatening, lethal, terminal, and finally incurable. This is exactly what the law of Moses, the Levitical system, was all about, showing humanity the evil in our uncontrollably, wickedly corrupt hearts and revealing our inability to change them. This is why God puts Abraham into a deep sleep in Genesis when making a covenant with him to form Israel as a nation from his offspring in faith, and that God walked the ceremony on his own to fulfill his part, knowing man could never fulfill our vows. Christ died for us because we owed a debt we could not pay, and he paid it on our behalf. The wages of sin and evil is death, but tetelestai is what Jesus says on the cross, and it means it's finished. The debt is now paid. And forever, if you follow me, if you lay down the world, or you lay down the world and yourself and pick up life anew in me. And I would read this chunk of Job as he had moral reverence for the divine being and turned his back on malignance in opposition to the divine being. And that's where I want to end this episode, episode 1 of this series on right now. And we have context already to how different the book of Job is from how it's normally being taught to us. And I'm going to see you guys in the next episode, and we're just going to keep going through 1 to 2 verses at a time here. And we're going to see how incredible the poetry and the meaning of this book really is. And I'll see you guys next time.